Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at 1 Kings chapter 19, the flight of Elijah. And I don't mean flying like a bird, I mean flying as in running away. Remember in the previous chapter, we had seen this picture of Elijah and the prophets of Baal. There had been 3.5 years of no rain over a period of 3 years. Then Elijah had come forth and made his challenge that all of the prophets of Baal would be assembled. There would be two altars, two groups of prophets. Of course, two groups. He was one group himself. The other group were the prophets of Baal, this pagan god, and whichever could call fire down from heaven, that would be the one that everyone would worship as God. And of course, fire did come down from heaven and consume Elijah's sacrifice. Subsequent to that, the false prophets of all of the idol worshippers were destroyed. Verse 41, we have Elisha's command to eat and drink. Here it is, 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 41. Now Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of the roar of a heavy shower." And that's going to be one of a number of references that we'll see in this chapter to eating and drinking. But that story continues where Ahab, sure enough, he's told to eat and drink, so he does dine. And then Elijah prays for rain, and he sends his servant to the top of the mountain, go look for a sign. Do you see any rain coming? And after about 7 times, the servant finally says, yes, I see this cloud is as big as a man's hand. And now the servant is sent to go and speak to Ahab, telling Ahab, go mount your chariot because the rain is coming. So notice the two references to a servant. Now the rain comes, which Elijah had prayed for, and Ahab rides to Jezebel, tried to get ahead of the rain, and Elijah actually beats him there to Jezreel. And now as our story opens, chapter 19, verse 1, now Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with a sword. So we read about the story taking place in chapter 18. In chapter 19, verse 1, Ahab gets home. He tells his wife, Queen Jezebel, what has taken place. Back in chapter 18, we saw Elijah. He was strong in the power of God. He was strong in prayer. He was sort of facing down all of the people of Israel, all the prophets of Baal. But in chapter 19, we're going to see a very different picture of Elijah. He will be relatively weak. He will be walking out of his own tactics or solutions. In chapter 18, he's ministering to others. In chapter 19, we're going to see his attention focused upon himself. In chapter 18, he's bold, he's confident in the face of 450 prophets of Baal. Now he's going to be fearful of Jezebel. In fact, he's going to be running, and I think we can build a case for running scared. Chapter 19, verse 2 is the turning point that leads to that. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so may the gods do to me, and even more, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time. What Jezebel is doing, she's putting a curse on herself if Elijah is not put to death. In other words, it's really going to happen. And what takes place now, chapter 19, verse 3, and he was afraid. Who was afraid? That's Elijah. And arose and ran for his life and came to Beersheba. Now, Beersheba is at the other end of Canaan. You go as far south as you can go and still be in the land of Canaan, and that's Beersheba. In fact, it's out of the land of Israel because it's in the land of Judah. Remember, at this time, Israel was the kingdom in the north, Judah is the kingdom in the south, and Elijah runs all the way there and left his servant there. We're not going to read about his servant again, at least not throughout the rest of this chapter. But when we read that he was afraid, you ought to know that there is a translation issue. We read this phrase in the King James, the old King James Version, and instead of saying he was afraid, it says, and when he saw that thing that Jezebel had said. Then he arose and ran for his life. What was he afraid, or was it something that he had seen? And the issue is how you translate this Hebrew phrase, vayireh, which can mean, if we take it as the cal imperfect of ra'ah is just the word to look, can mean that he saw. That would work. The vav takes, I don't want to get too technical here, imperfect is usually future, unless there's a vav in front of it, and then it makes it past tense. But if we take it instead as the cal imperfect of yareh, which means to be afraid, then we can translate it, he was afraid. Which was it? You see, the same form of the word can be taken either way. That doesn't happen a lot, but occasionally it happens where one word can have two entirely different meanings. And in this, usually you just say, well, what does the context say? And the context makes it very clear. But in this case, the context fits either one. Was this something that he saw? Or was it fear? I think that the New American Standard translates it as it says he was afraid. I think they have captured the correct idea. Verse 4, but he himself, remember he leaves his servant there in Beersheba, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat under a juniper tree. A juniper tree is like a desert tree. It doesn't have much in the way of leaves. It has a little bit of shade. But when you're in the desert, let me speak from experience, when you're in the desert, a little bit of shade is better than no shade. And so he sat down under a juniper tree, and he requested for himself that he might die, and said, it is enough. Now, O Lord, take my life, for I am not better than my fathers. Now, let me just say, I think that was one of those dumb prayers. Because if he wanted to die, all he had to do was stay back in Israel. And Jezebel was more than glad to accommodate him. But God doesn't answer this prayer. Indeed, it reminds us as he stands there or sits there under the juniper tree of Psalm chapter 121, verse 5. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade on your right hand. And we're going to see the Lord not only providing him the shade of the juniper tree, but the Lord is going to be his shade. The verse goes on to say, Psalm 121, verses 6 and 7, the sun will not smite you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will protect you from all evil. He will keep your soul. And that is exactly what God is doing in this passage. Verse 5, and he lay down and slept under the juniper tree. And behold, there was an angel touching him. That's probably how he woke up. And said to him, arise, eat. Verse 6, then he looked, and behold, there was at his head a bread cake baked on hot stones. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Now wait a second. Remember how there was a reference to eating at the very beginning, actually at the end of the last chapter. And now again he's told to eat and rest. And verse 7, and the angel of the Lord came again a second time and touched him and said, arise, eat, because the journey is too great for you. So again, there is a feeding and a meal. Verse 8, so he arose and ate and drank and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. And when you speak of the mountain of God, Horeb, that's another name, that's another word for Sinai. He's going down to Mount Sinai, the same mountain where Moses had been for 40 days and for 40 nights. That's how long the flood had taken place. Moses had been on Mount Sinai for 40 days and 40 nights receiving the law. Elijah now comes down here on the strength of that food for 40 days and for 40 nights. And we will remember ahead to how Jesus went into the wilderness to be tested by God. Actually, to be tempted, he was sent by the Spirit, but he was tempted not by God, but by Satan for 40 days and 40 nights. So now he goes to Horeb. And the name Horeb actually means waste or desolation. And it's a very desolate place. There's not a lot nowadays. It's a little bit more comfortable nowadays. They actually have some houses and a monastery that's built at the base of the mountain. But back in Elijah's day, there was nothing like that. And so indeed it was a waste and a desolation. And this reminds us of how Moses, who had faced the Pharaoh of Egypt, just as Elijah now has faced Ahab and more recently Jezebel, about how Moses, his word brought 10 plagues against Egypt, and likewise Elijah, his prayer had stopped the rain in Israel. And they had both now come to meet the Lord at Mount Sinai. In Moses' case, the Israelites ate manna in the wilderness. In Elijah's case, he was supernaturally fed by an angel. In Moses' case, he established the covenant of the law. And in Elijah's case, he's going to change and charge the nation with covenant breaking. And there's a sense in which, Moses brought the law. After Elijah and his ministry, we will begin to see the ministry of the written prophets. The prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and all the minor prophets are going to come once Elijah has come. Well, verse 9, he came there to a cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, when he says he came there to a cave, actually the Hebrew says he came to the cave. And I don't know if it was a specific cave or that's just a figure of speech, but that's what the Hebrew text says. And then God questions him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Well, Elijah answers the Lord. He said, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with a sword, and I alone am left." We say, wait a second, weren't those 100 prophets that had been hidden by Obadiah a couple of chapters ago? Well, yes, but as far as those that were making a stand, that had stood up in the presence of king and country, Elijah says, "I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Well, God answers him. So he said, "Go forth and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord was passing by. And a great and strong wind was rending the mountain and breaking in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But that wasn't the Lord. The Lord was not in the wind. The Lord was passing by, but that's not how he passed by. And after the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. Verse 12, and after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a gentle blowing. The King James Version calls it a still small voice. The New International Version calls it a gentle whisper. The New Revised Standard Version calls it a sound of sheer silence. Each one capturing an idea of how it is described to us in the Hebrew text. And each one, I think, is correct insofar as it goes. God shows up, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, not in the roar, but in the sound of a gentle blowing. What's the point of that? What's the point that's being made? The point is that God sometimes shows up, not in ways that we expect. And so, in verse 13, Elijah, when he heard it, this sound of a gentle blowing, the still small voice, he wrapped his face in his mantle. That reminds us of how Moses wrapped his face in a mantle when he went before the presence of God and when he came down. And Elijah went out and stood in the entrance of the cave, and behold, a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What's going on?" And so he wraps his face. He goes to meet God. And now we are told, remember what's taken place already. He had run to Beersheba. He had come into the wilderness. He'd been fed by an angel twice, not once, but twice. He is asked by God, what are you doing here, Elijah? And again, notice how each thing has taken place twice. There's been, in a sense, two different flights, two different feedings, two different questions. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah answers about how Israel has forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets. And here he says it again, verse 14, I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. And now the Lord answers him. Verse 15. The Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, which is not going back to Israel. He's going to make a big detour around Israel. He's going to go far north of Israel. Right now he's far south of Israel. He's going to go all the way to Damascus. And when you have arrived, you shall anoint Hazael king over Aram. That's not the one who's king right now. And not only that, and Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint as king over Israel. That's not who is king of Israel right now. You're going to anoint them as future kings of Damascus and a future king of Israel. And not only that, and Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. There's going to be eventually, not going to happen immediately, not going to happen tomorrow, but we're planning for the next phase, and there will be replacements of these two kings and also of you. So Hazael and Jehu and Elisha are each going to be anointed as promissory that God is going to continue his work even after Elijah is gone. So you shall anoint, here they are on a map. Hazael is going to be king over Aram to the north, and then Jehu is going to be king over Israel. And of course, Elijah is not a king, and Elisha likewise will be a prophet. But Elisha will be the prophet in your place eventually. And so as we look at these three names, Hazael, Jehu, and Elisha, Hazael is going to be over Aram, Jehu over Israel, Elisha will be the prophet. Hazael is the picture of international politics. Jehu is the national politics, and Elisha, that's going to be the spiritual leadership of the nation. And God is concerned with all three. And he will bring his will about. Both to the non-Israelite Hazael and to the Israelites, both Israel as a nation and the spiritual prophet for the nation. Verse 17, it shall come about the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. In other words, these will have a ministry, if you want to call it that, a ministry of judgment. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. It's not that Elisha is going to be running around killing people, but he will prophesy and they will die. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. Elijah, you thought you were the only one? Well, I'm going to give you a helper, one to come alongside you. But you're not the only one. There are 7,000 still of a remnant in Israel. And so, verse 19, he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, while he was plowing with 12 pairs of oxen. Now, 12 pairs of oxen aren't usually on one plow, so I'm not sure if that's what it meant. Might mean that he had 12 different yokes and different servants and people that were all involved. So, in other words, it sounds like Elisha was a well-to-do man. He was living a very prosperous lifestyle. And he, with the 12th, you see, there's 12 different oxen groups that are plowing, and he's with one of those. And Elijah passed over to him and threw his mantle on him. Now notice the mantle, because we're going to see that in a future chapter. Verse 20, he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, "Please let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." And he said to him, "Yeah, go back again, for what have I done to you?" Now, there's a similar reference over in Luke chapter 9 where Jesus calls someone, actually several, but one of them, notice, also said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first permit me to say goodbye to those at home." And Elisha's words sound a little similar, although I'm not sure that they are, because in the first case, in the case of the one who was asked to follow Jesus, it may very well be that he said, let me say goodbye to them, and they'll live out their life, and then we'll say goodbye, and eventually I'll get around to following you. In Elisha's case, he's going to make this fairly quick, and we're going to follow him to see what happens. By the way, Jesus has said to the one who didn't want to follow, or at least didn't want to do it today, "No one, after putting his hand to the plow and looking back, is fit for the kingdom of God." When you follow Jesus, don't wait. Follow him today. And yet, I don't think that Elisha, as he said that, was not meaning to follow the Lord today, because we'll look and see what happens. You see, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" asks an interesting question, which now is answered. And we could translate that, we could render that expression as, "No problem, go ahead," or perhaps, "Go ahead, but don't forget what I've called you to do. Don't let this moment pass." In any case, in verse 21, so he returned from following him and took the pair of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh. Notice he's not going to be able to plow with them anymore. He's cutting all ties. He's putting a stop to his former profession. He sacrifices these oxen, boiled their flesh with the implements of the oxen. That is, he gets rid of not only the oxen, but the ox goad and the yoke. And then he takes the flesh and gave it to the people, and they ate. And then he arose and followed Elijah and ministered to him. Notice that there is a meal and then a following. It reminds me of how we've been invited to a meal, but that's not the end of the story. Then we're called to go and follow him. And there's a reminder here. There's a reminder because remember how Elijah's problem is that he felt like he had been alone and he needed somebody to come alongside him. We have someone who has come alongside us. It is Jesus who died and was buried and rose again, but prior to his ascension, told his disciples, "Yes, I'm sending you to the world, make disciples of all men, teaching and baptizing and letting them know everything I did. And lo, I am with you always." You say, how is he with us always? He ascended into heaven. He sent his Spirit. And if you trust in him, he is with you even today.